Greetings, kittens. I hope you've had a wonderful week. I've been out shopping today. Honestly, I spent 2 minutes inside one of those ghastly clothes stores, and I was out again like a shot. There were almost no black dresses available. I mean, what's with all these hideous pastels everyone's wearing nowadays? You know, another reason I love funerals, apart from the obvious, everyone always looks so fashionable for once in their lives. Now, on to the first story. And what's your opinion on monks? Have you ever met one? Ever seen one? Our next listener had quite the experience.
"3 years ago, I arranged to meet with a Buddhist monk who held his own teaching practice for meditation. I was very anxious leading up to it because this was totally out of my comfort zone. When I arrived, he bowed and immediately invited me to sit down in meditation for 10 minutes. Of course, we hadn't even greeted each other yet, so I'm way overthinking it. I sat down, and a few minutes later, I experienced something crazy. It felt like being dizzy, horizontally, like my mind was doing backflips, and it made me nauseous. I had a clear vision that he was literally trying to pull my consciousness up into this room, to speak with me there. It was clear as day, and I was terrified. Coming out of the meditation, I was sweating. I told him about it right away. I was a blubbering fool. And he just smiled, reminded me to breathe, and said the mind can play tricks on us. But that's not the end of the story. After I left, despite my extremely anxious experience, I felt inexplicably calm, awake and present. It was a pleasant feeling, and I went to Ocean State Job Lot to pick up some things. As I was walking down an aisle, I made brief eye contact with an older man. My immediate thought was that he knows, he sees me, he gets it. I guess what I meant was he was aware and awake too, and I could see it. So I walk around, I'm standing in the pasta aisle, and he stops at the end and just starts talking. I don't even know what he's talking about at first, but I just listened. Any other day, I would have thought he was a creep. Finally, my mind snapped into attention when he said something like, "Most people would have ignored me, so thank you. You know why I'm here, right? Because you get it. I saw it when you walked down the aisle." I felt like time stood still. My heart was racing, but I still felt emotionally calm. He starts telling me that when he was a kid, his mum knew he had a gift when he approached a woman at the store and said, "It's a good thing your dog was in the front seat." The woman apparently told his mum she'd been in an accident and the dog would have died if she had put him in the back seat as usual. And then he starts saying stuff about me that no one else could have known. I like nature and I feel confident and alive outdoors. I'm a giver, but I have a hard time receiving. People lean on me for support and I take pride in this, but I hide my emotions from others and then resent that they're not there for me as much. That I'm independent and stubborn, on. And the one that really got me, that would be impossible to predict, that I feel the most at peace and connected to myself when I'm by bodies of water because I associate it with the seat of the soul. I've been dreaming about water every night for over a decade. I often associate it with the subconscious. And where do I go when I need to center myself? Water. Every single time. I have no way of explaining this. He left by saying that something was going to happen to me. Of course, I panicked, but he said, "I can't tell you, but you are going to be very, very happy." All of this in Ocean State Job Lot. I left literally dumbfounded, like almost in tears at this experience, but also the very different state that I felt we were in. It didn't feel like everyday life. Everything stood still. And to top it off, he introduced himself as Joe Lasagna while we talked in the pasta aisle. I just want to add that this experience made me realise that not only is our perception shaped by our thoughts, the world interacts with us differently based on how open we are and our mind state. I thoroughly believe that had I not been in whatever state that was, this wouldn't have happened. I don't know how I got there, or how to get back, but imagine what world of possibility would open up if we could.
I want to clarify before retelling of events that I was only about 9 or 10 when this took place. Some of this is what my parents have retold me and not just my own memories. Getting that out of the way, let's begin. When my younger cousin first started speaking, right away he would speak to things that weren't there. More often than not, he would be laughing, singing, or other general baby babble. This was completely harmless at first, and we all chalked it up to an overactive imagination. When he turned 3, he started calling his imaginary friends by name. Nana J, our grandmother who had passed when he was only 3 weeks old, and Grandma Margaret, our other grandmother who had died 17 years before I was born. Now, of course, it is possible that he had heard the older members of the family speak of them, which is also what everyone thought it was at first. However, soon he started saying things that he couldn't have known. He often talked about the car crash that had killed Nana J's brother in 1978. He knew Grandma Margaret used vanilla extract as perfume, something my mother herself barely remembered. He also said that our deceased grandparents had told him what we had bought him for Christmas, and then pointed at every package, listing exactly what was in them and where we had bought them. He was right. When he turned 5, he didn't talk to our grandmothers anymore. Around this time, we had also moved into a new and rather shady apartment complex that was rumored to be used to house illegal immigrants from Mexico hiding from the cartel. In this apartment there were 2 floors, with my cousin and I's room being right over the kitchen, which he said made him feel sick. He would rarely sleep in there at night, and I in turn wouldn't sleep in there either. The kitchen was the actual problem, not the bedroom. The animals in the house wouldn't go in the kitchen during the day unless someone was with them, and not at all during the night. Quite regularly, the light bulbs in the light fixtures would burst, and the washing machine would run even though we had unplugged it when we first moved in. The first time my cousin brought something up about the kitchen, I was holding him in my arms while we watched a movie. I remember he looked up at me and stared with those giant blue eyes, and then he asked so sweetly, "Kayla, do you know the monster in the kitchen? He's mean, right?" I didn't really know how to answer him at all, so I only kissed his little head and made him go to bed. That wasn't the last time he brought up the monster, but it seemed the longer we lived there, the more the thing in the kitchen affected him. He started acting out. He would scream and would then laugh maniacally if spanked or put into timeout. He would slam his head into walls. He would punch and bite and pull hair, but a few hours later would sob and apologize and show genuine guilt. One day, after his mother had foot surgery, he ran down the stairs and stomped on her freshly bandaged wound as hard as he could. I remember hearing him scream and sob upstairs for hours until he finally came down, laid in his mother's lap, and said, "I'm sorry, Mommy. The monster from the kitchen made me." A few days later, he had taken all the knives and scissors in the house and placed them in our aunt's bedroom. He was scolded, of course, but said that if he didn't move them, then the kitchen man would hurt us. The same day as the sharp object incident, he sat in the corner of the living room next to my aunt, who had her back to the kitchen doorway. Suddenly, he looked up and laughed, and said, "Auntie, if I turn off the light, then the kitchen man will get you." He didn't turn it off, but we were all on edge until we went to bed. My family assumed it was mental illness or autism that was causing these outbursts, and darker visions that were plaguing my poor baby cousin. Doctors said it wasn't any sort of mental illness that they could detect, and he didn't appear to have autism. We were back to the drawing board. Regardless, we all simply continued to think he was simply mentally ill. That was, until the night we all saw the monster too. My cousin and I were playing with my dollhouse that was up against the wall where the stairs were. The slope was quite steep and then continued to make a long, flat wall all the way into where it broke off in the kitchen. My aunt, my mom, and then my cousin's mom were all gathered on the couch watching TV. I was doing my own thing for the moment until my cousin gripped onto my side. Thinking he just wanted a hug, I took him into my arms and laughed until he lets out that nervous and quiet wail kids often do. I was about to ask what was wrong when I see the shadow of a tall figure on the wall of the stairs. I whipped my head back to see what could be making that shadow, but there was quite literally nothing in the path of the lamp. Slowly, the shadow walked across the wall before disappearing into the dark kitchen. For a moment, nothing else happened, until a hand that was just not quite human pops out from the dark, beckoning the two kids to it. We both jump into our parents' lap. They tell us we were going to get a hotel for the night, having seen the figure too. We moved out soon after. My cousin is 12 now, and talks to our past family again. He hasn't ever mentioned the monster again. In fact, whenever we bring it up, he seems to not even know what we're talking about. He doesn't act out anymore. I hope it stays that way.
It was April. It didn't feel like April after the amount of time that had passed, but it was April nonetheless. In fact, March had just ended, mere hours before I arrived here. I live in a city, a college town that's tried to keep up, but has still suffered. I left the city on the last day of March. It was raining when I bustled out of my apartment and into my mother's messy van. Bags surrounded me, cramping me into the car under their weight. I left the city on the last day of March. I was sick, or at least I thought I was. I had to quarantine, 2 weeks in isolation. I would have stayed at my apartment, but I had roommates, and I was courteous enough to pack some things and go so they didn't have to worry about getting sick. My parents' house was as it always was, vibrant, active, warm, and something that was oddly comforting but unsettling at the same time. Maybe it was because the person I used to be lived in this house, survived in this house, existed in this house. I had changed so much since then, but something about being in the house in my old bedroom, reliving everything that I'd once lived, it felt like some sort of deja vu that I couldn't quite remember, but couldn't quite shake. The first night, I sat in bed a while, trying to entertain myself or lose myself in thought to take my ever-active mind off of my circumstances. It was depressing, the feeling of being trapped, but there was no escaping it. I couldn't try. Even if I wanted to, I was shackled. At some point in the night, I remember, vaguely however, getting up and going to the bathroom. The clock read 3:13 a.m., which I only remembered due to the fact that I acknowledged that as it was the witching hour. I know that it wasn't a dream. I remember getting up and walking. I plugged my phone in, bringing it with me as a light, and took the short walk across the hallway into my old bathroom. I used to share it with my sister back when we lived here, but grew out of it and left it when I moved out. I barely remembered ever using it. There was always something ominous about being in my parents' house in the darkness and obscurity of night. Quite often, in fact, I remarked joking to my mother that it was a perfect slasher house, and how a horror movie set within it would be perfectly eerie. There was something unexplainable about the energy. I never quite understood why. Even now, as an adult, my body still trembles as I get up and out of bed, and if I walk anywhere in the house in the dark. I made the short journey as my legs shook and my focus was set on being aware of my surroundings. I entered the bathroom, turning on the lights and shutting and locking the door behind me as fast as I could. For a brief moment, I turned to face the mirror on the wall directly across from where I was standing. Something was drawing me to it for some reason or another, but I didn't know what that reason was. I stared into the mirror, seeing every part of myself as I did, and felt something indescribable. This energy was pulling me towards it, closer and closer, but I didn't know what it was or why. I barely knew what I was feeling besides the sensation of pulling. But the strange part was, it was a nostalgic feeling. I knew that I had felt that feeling before, but I had no idea why, when, or what it was. It was the strangest thing. I woke up in my bed the next day with no recollection of what had happened. I remembered walking to the bathroom, staring in the mirror, being affected by it, and then nothing. I knew it wasn't a dream. I had gotten up and walked there. I knew it. My phone was even unplugged from when I took it with me. I had no idea whatsoever of how I had gotten back into my bed, how I had fallen asleep, or how I had even gotten out of the bathroom. Strange, I thought to myself. But you're probably just tired. It was probably nothing. I didn't say anything about it, though I thought about bringing it up to my mother and father. What good would they have done? The most I could do is ask if they had heard me get up last night, but I already knew that they were both long asleep. Quite honestly, after a few hours, I brushed it off and almost forgot that it had happened. The next night, though, the same thing happened. I woke up the night... Roll that back. The next night, though, the same thing had happened. I woke up in the night having to go to the bathroom, made my way there, petrified in the darkness, and somehow wound up in my bed again the next morning as if nothing had happened. I wondered if I was having reoccurring dreams or maybe even sleepwalking, but no answer made sense. I couldn't brush it off after a few nights in a row. It was really messing with me. I thought about what was happening every morning for prolonged amounts of time and wondered how I could stop it, but nothing worked. I took sleeping pills, which I normally use for my insomnia spells, but even still, I woke up. I was losing time. How does one lose time like that? It had never happened to me before any of these circumstances. It was like I was blacked out drunk or something. I knew what happened to me up until a certain point in the night, and then everything stopped. I woke up the next morning safe in bed. I wanted to know what happened during that time I lost, but there was no way I was going to get any answers. A week had passed. That meant there was only 1 week left until I could go back to the city, back to my space. On that 7th night, I again woke up in the night. I looked at the clock again, and it still read 3:13 a.m. I had noticed this a few times now, and it had caught my attention as something else strange in my situation. As I felt more ill each day and needed more and more rest, I began to attribute these spells to possible hallucinations driven by my fever. I really convinced myself until, that is, the 7th night. I made my way across the hall in the darkness again, phone in hand. Guess what time? 3:13 a.m. as usual. Odd sensation as usual. That time, however, I had a plan. I was sick of what I was going through each night. It was starting to affect me mentally. I was down, dreary, zombie-like. On top of having an illness, I was suffering greater in this way. It was sheer torture. I hit record on my phone, and the video started recording as I opened the door to the bathroom. I stood in there for a moment, feeling the same eerie, nostalgic feeling, and then nothing. I woke up in my bed the next morning like usual, with my phone next to me, unplugged, as usual. Immediately, I rolled over and grabbed it, opening it as quickly as I could. I frantically typed in my password, and my camera app was still open. I clicked on the most recent video, and I saw myself in the mirror holding the camera. I remembered doing that. Then after a moment, there was a darkness, a dark shadow in the mirror. Immediately, the phone slammed down onto the floor, and I couldn't see anymore. The video stopped. I went back and forth over and over to try to get a glimpse of the shadow in the mirror. It was a figure I knew it was. After getting a perfect view on the screen, I was sure of this. I texted my sister that day, begging to come and stay with her on the couch. She asked why couldn't I just go home, but she already knew the answer. I took her question and response as a no and moved on. I felt like I was going crazy, but I knew that what I had saw was real. Not only that, but it was taking a toll on me. I felt paranoid, crazy, and I was losing weight. I was pale as a ghost, and the bags under my eyes looked heavier than ever before. I kept losing my time, and it was driving me mad. That 8th night, I decided to get ahead of it. I went into the bathroom at midnight once my parents were asleep with my phone and waited. I stayed up those 3 hours, and I waited. Before I knew it, the time must have come because I felt its presence. I knew it was there with me, watching me. I stood up slowly on my shaky legs and stared into the mirror. I stared as if I wanted to know that I was aware of its presence. I took deep breaths in order to stabilize myself, but I felt more unstable than ever. That same nostalgic feeling came back to me, overtaking my body and making me feel like a weak, vulnerable child again. Blood rushed through my veins, and I could feel my heart beating in every individual part of my body. The lights went off. The shadow appeared behind me in the reflection, and the moment it did, I remembered it. I knew this shadow. It had always been in the mirror here. I never recalled using the bathroom then, because I never remembered doing so. It always made sure of that. But after a moment of the shadow and I being aware of one another's presence, it happened again. I lost time. But this time, I didn't wake up in bed. I woke up on the floor of the bathroom in the dark. Groggily, I coughed and squinted my eyes as they adjusted to being open again. My mouth was dry and tasted horrible. I tried to chew my face a bit in an attempt to fix it or even to recognize the taste, but it stayed. My body was sore and pained, and I felt a certain emptiness. After a moment, I turned my attention away from my immediate self and towards my surroundings. I tilted my head up slightly and saw my grotesque state. I was sprawled out on the bathroom floor, covered in my own vomit, which trailed all around me and into the toilet that sat near my feet. There was so much of it, as if I had emptied out my entire body somehow. I sat up in a panic and began to wipe it all off of me. My body was shaking, tears rushed to my eyes as I tried to understand what had happened. I felt a chill in the air right before the lights turned on again, and my eyes squinted, trying to adjust to the painful addition to my setting. I quickly shot my torso up and backed myself up against a wall, on the brink of being hysterical at this point. Silent tears ran down my face as my eyes darted around the room, looking for the shadow. I woke up in bed again. Immediately, I jumped out of bed and ran into the bathroom in order to prove my sanity to myself, to make sure that the scene I had surveyed was still there. But it wasn't. Everything was gone. Every last bit of it. My body, too, was clean. My mouth wasn't dry and didn't taste horrendous. What happened in my lost time? I didn't go to the bathroom anymore at night, not for the last few days of my stay. I noticed then that I wasn't losing weight as rapidly as I was before, nor was I feeling as anxious, paranoid, and overall insane. I felt somewhat rejuvenated, yeah, but I was still aware. I knew that I had experienced something, but I also knew that I couldn't share that experience. But the worst part wasn't the secretive nature I had to have, but the fact that I knew that I had gone through it all before. After living it again, memories began to flood back. I knew now why I had claimed I never used that bathroom, why I didn't even remember using it. I was losing time, more time than my last encounters. Something in there was taking me over and making me sick, making me suffer. It drew me into the mirror as I stared at myself and took me over. All those years it had happened, but I had just suppressed it or written it off or was simply unaware because I had lost so much time. I don't go in that bathroom anymore. Not ever. I feel healthier now, happier now. On my last day of quarantining, I sit here thinking about it and just how peculiar and horrifying it all was. I thought of all the problems I had suffering while living in this house, and the times I didn't really truly feel okay, and remembered what I experienced in the past weeks. Surely there was something evil in there, something oppressive, something that wanted to make me suffer. While carrying this burden of knowledge, I decided to send a message to my sister. She and I were close, being only a year apart in age, and had shared many experiences together, just like we had shared the bathroom. The messages read as follows. "Hey, quick question for you," I started, trying not to sound too certifiable right off the bat. "What's up?" she responded after a few minutes. I thought of how to phrase my next response. "At Mom and Dad's house, did you ever see anything weird in the bathroom?" "What do you mean?" she sent, immediately followed by, "You mean our old bathroom, right?" "Yeah," I replied. "Have you ever seen anything weird in there?" "You saw him too, didn't you?" she said, really spooking me now. "Him?" I said. "What do you mean, him?" "The shadow," she typed. 2 words turned my entire world upside down. 2 words toppled my heart from pulsing and froze my blood. My bones went stiff. My fingers were frozen in shock as my eyes stared at the 2 words. The shadow. I couldn't even think clearly, never mind respond in my state of shock. Luckily, she sent me another message as my eyes were glued in terror to her response. "I can't believe you saw him too." "What are you talking about?" I said, still shocked, as terror filled my veins. "I thought I must have been crazy all these years," she said. Did you lose time too?" And woke up in my bed the next day as if it was nothing. She finished my thought before I could. My whole body was cold now. She saw the shadow too. She identified it. It wasn't in my head after all. I knew this whole time, but I was sure of it now. Thinking on it, I begin to remember blocking out the loss of time. Never waking up in the night, never using the bathroom, always feeling tired, meek, or vaguely ill. Always feeling a wave of discomfort and pain looking in that mirror. But I never truly understood why it was me. Well, me and my sister, that the shadow had robbed.
This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm 21 now, and it has never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. My grandfather passed away close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. They don't really pertain to the story, and there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best way. My grandfather, John, was a man who was extremely callous and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a complete macho man. My mother was raised on never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others. He also was an extreme racist. He had many secrets in my family that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. Just an overall intense and very no-nonsense type of man. He also was not religious at all and found things like faith and hope stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mom was born in 1965 and remembers the story clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year. One summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother, or my grandmother, were all there and very excited about this. Where we're from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a dirt backwoods road and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around, as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up. As he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eyes. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to my family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother didn't think much of this since they were all used to the woods, and these woods in particular were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff they'd brought. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. The mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be an animal in these woods. There was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in the area. Scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry and continued playing while just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed the noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. John was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman she is, soothed her children and told them it was left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it. At least no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the wood that they began to really panic. My grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went in a quick bum, bum, bum pattern. 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was getting not just louder, but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chest. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate in their chest. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go!" he yelled. "Get in the car!" He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen terror on this man as they had at that moment. He was a man afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back in the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother packed up their things and as quickly as possible threw it all into the car. They had no care for the things that they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk and items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away. This is where the main grunt of the story ends. But one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children or my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them not to ask again. He never went to the police or told anyone outside of the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself I would ask him one day. Now I can't, and I regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of an occasional happy birthday call or letter. The story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We weren't close when I got older, and once I learned of all the abuse he caused, I separated myself from him. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood. Nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I'm one of the only people in the family who is still curious what happened. I've always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, the conspiracy theories. This story piqued my interest more than any others in my family. I only wish I had answers.
Well, that just about wraps up tonight's show, darlings. Do keep rating and reviewing the show, sweeties, as it really does help. And remember to send in your strange but true creepy stories to deadlydebbie@mail.com. Pleasant dreams.